Okay, the clock has turned 9, and so we shall start. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories. My name is Sean Griffiths, and I'm an architect, artist and writer, and I'm also Professor of Architecture at the University of Westminster, and some of you may know me as one of the 3 members of the practice FAT, which disbanded in 2014. Tonight's story comprises some excerpts from the novel Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon, published in 1997, I believe, and it's a retelling of the story of the drawing of the Mason-Dixon line by 2 British surveyors in the 18th century, just prior to the American War of Independence. And the line was commissioned to settle a land dispute concerning the position of the boundary between the then provinces of Pennsylvania and Maryland. And it required a partnership of an astronomer and a surveyor who would determine the correct position of the line by measuring from the stars and then projecting the line onto the ground in real time. And as such, this straight line was literally carved into the ground using teams of axemen, post drivers and chainmen who marked the line in response to the surveyor's instructions. So the novel is a philosophical meditation on the nature and import of the straight line, which is a child of the Enlightenment imposed on from the Western point of view, at least at that time, uninhabited land of America. And therefore it's very much about a kind of violence, the violence of making straight lines, which of course is what we, architects, spend a great deal of time doing as we partition the earth into parcels of property, social hierarchy and use. It's very difficult to do justice to the book. I don't know if anyone has read it who is listening in tonight, but it interweaves this theme of drawing the line, which is kind of emblematic of the birth of modernity. And it's full of ruminations on science, on Jesuitism, on feng shui, on ley lines, on the enclosures, on ancient stone circles, on the Enlightenment, on colonialism. And it's strangely enough partly told in a Geordie accent, which you'll probably be relieved to hear that I'm not going to attempt tonight, because one of the main characters is a Geordie, Mr. Dixon, and the characters are indeed real historical figures, but they're portrayed here as being a little bit like Laurel and Hardy. And so the book is a sort of mixture of historical novel, buddy story, science fiction, adventure, and satire. And it's a virtuoso piece of writing, appropriately told as a fireside story by a clergyman to children in wintry Philadelphia in, I think, 1786 is the date it's set in. So I'm going to start with the Reverend Cherrycoke setting the scene in a passage which showcases Pynchon's fantastic ability as a writer. And then there will be some short passages looking at the nature of the line from the viewpoint of some of the characters in the novel. So here we go. Chapter 1. It's about 800 pages long, so I won't be reading all of them. Snowballs have flown their arcs, starred the size of outbuildings as of cousins, carried hats away into the brisk wind of Delaware. The sleds are brought in, and their runners carefully dried and greased, shoes deposited in the back hall, a stocking foot descent made upon the great kitchen, in a purposeful dither since morning, punctuated by the ringing lids of various boilers and stewing pots, fragrant with pie spices, peeled fruits, suet, heated sugar, the children having upon the fly, among rhythmic slaps of batter and spoon, coaxed and stolen what they might, Proceed as upon each afternoon all this snowy advent to a comfortable room at the rear of the house, years since given over to their carefree assaults. Here have come to rest a long-scarred sawbuck table with two mismatched side benches from the Lancaster County branch of the family, some 2nd Street Chippendale, including an interpretation of the famed Chinese sofa with a high canopy of yards of purple stuff that might be drawn all round to make a snug, dim tent. A few old chairs sent from England before the war, mostly pine and cherry, about, nor much mahogany, excepting a sinister and wonderful card table, which exhibits the cheaper wave-like grain known in the trade as wandering heart, causing an illusion of depth into which for years children have gazed as into the illustrated pages of books. Along with so many hinges, sliding mortises, hidden catches, and secret compartments that neither the twins nor their sister can say they have been to the end of it. Upon the wall banished to this den of parlour apes for its remembrance of a time better forgotten, reflecting most of the room, the carpet and drapes a little frayed, Whiskers the cat stalking beneath the furniture, looking out with eyes finely reflexive to anything suggesting food, hangs a mirror in an inscribed frame, commemorating Miss Kianza, that memorable farewell ball staged in 77 by the British who'd been occupying the city just before their withdrawal from Philadelphia. This Christmas tide of 1786, with the war settled and the nation bickering itself into fragments, wounds bodily and ghostly, great and small, go aching on, not every one commemorated, nor too often even recounted. Snow lies upon all Philadelphia from river to river, whose further shores have so vanished behind curtains of ice fog that the city today might be an isle upon an ocean. Ponds and creeks are frozen over, and the trees aglare to the slightest twig, nerve lines of concentrated light. Hammers and saws have fallen still, bricks lie in snow-covered heaps. City sparrows in speckled outbursts hop in and out of what shelter there may be. The nightward sky, clouds blown to chalk smears, stretches above the northern liberties, Spring Garden and Germantown. Its early pale moon, as pale as the snowdrift, smoke ascends from chimney pots. Sledging parties adjourn indoors. Taverns bustle. Freshly infused coffee flows every place, borne about through rooms front and back, whilst Madeira, which has ever fueled association in these parts, is deployed nowadays like an ancient elixir upon the seething pot of politics. For the times are as impossible to calculate this advent as the distance of a star. It has become an afternoon habit for the twins and their sister, with what friends old and young may find their way here, to gather for another tale from their far-travelled uncle, the Reverend Wicks Cherrycoke, who arrived here back in October for the funeral of a friend of years ago, too late for the bad burial as it proved, and has lingered as a guest in the house of his sister, the wife for many years of Mr. J. Wade Lespark, a respected merchant active in town affairs, whilst his home yet sultan enough to convey to the Reverend, though without ever so stipulating that for as long as he can keep the children amused he may remain, too much evidence of juvenile rampage at the wrong moment, however, and Boppo 'twill be out the door with him where waits the winter's block and blade. Thus we have heard the escape from Hottentot land, the accursed ruby of Mogok, the shipwrecks in Indies, east and west, An Herodotic web of adventures and curiosities selected, the Reverend implies, for their moral usefulness, whilst avoiding others not as suitable in the hearing of youth. The youth, as usual, not being consulted in this. Tenebrae has seated herself and taken up her needlework, a piece whose size and difficulty are already subjects of discussion in the house, the embroideress herself keeping silence upon this topic at least. Announced by nasal telegraph, in come the twins bearing the old pewter coffee machine, venting its puffs of vapour, and a large basket dedicated to satramaniac appetites, piled to the brim with fresh-filled doughnuts rolled in sugar, glazed in chestnuts, buns, fritters, crullers, tarts. What is this? Why, lads, you read my mind. The coffee's for you, nunk. Last time you were talking in your sleep, the pair explain, placing the sweets nearer themselves, all in this room being left to seize and pour as they may. As none could agree which had been born first, the twins were named Pitt and Pliny, so that each might be termed the elder or the younger, as might day to day please one or annoy his brother. Why haven't we heard a tale about America? Pick licking gobbets of Philadelphia pudding from his best jabbet. With Indians in it and Frenchmen, adds Pliny, whose least gesture sends cookie crumbs everywhere. French women come to that, mutters Pitt. It's not easy being pious for both of us, you know, Pliny advises. It's 20 years, recalls the Reverend, since we all topped the Allegheny Ridge together and stood looking out at the Ohio country, so fair a revelation meadowed to the horizon. Mason and Dixon and all the McLeans, Darby and Cope. No, Darby wouldn't have been there in 66. Howbeit, old Mr. Barnes and young Tom Hines, the rascal, don't know where they all went. Some fought in the war, some chose peace come what might, some profited and some lost everything, some are gone to Kentucky, and some, so now poor Mason, to dust. 'Twas not too many years before the war. What were we doing out in that country? It was brave, scientific beyond my understanding, and ultimately meaningless. We were putting a line straight through the heart of the wilderness, 8 yards wide and due west, in order to separate two proprietorships granted when the world was yet feudal, but 8 years later to be nullified by the War of Independence. So that was the first chapter that or the first bit of the chapter that sets the scene. I'm now going to read a few passages from different characters that ruminate upon this idea of making a line in the landscape. And the first comes from the Spiritual Jade Day book of the same Wick's Cherrycoke. Now many is the philosophical mind, including my own, convinced that rapid motion through the air is possible along and above certain invisible straight lines crossing the earthly landscape, particularly in Britain where they are known as ley lines. Any number of devout enthusiasts, actual Stonehenge and Aylesbury pilgrims, quacks, mongers, bedlamites, each has his tale of real flights over the countryside above these ley lines. Withal, 'tis possible to transfer from one of them to another, and thus in theory travel to the furthest reaches of the kingdom without once touching the earth. Something is there that permits it. No one knows what it is, though. Thousands speculate. Here went we off upon the most prodigious such line yet attempted. In America, where undertakings of this scale are possible, astronomically precise, carefully set prisms of oolite, the master valve of rose quartz, at the eastern terminus. Any argument from designs here must include a yearning for flight, perhaps even higher and faster than is customary among ley lines we know. I try not to wonder. I must wonder. Whenever the surveyors separate, they run into thickets, bogs, bad dreams. United, they pursue a ride through the air. They are linked to the stars, to that inhuman precision, and are deferred to because of it, though also feared and resented. March is snowy and frozen, clear nights are rare, and the surveyors need every one they can get for azimuth observations to find out the exact direction westward to strike off. Everything upon the ground by April, as they're about to begin the west line, must be sighted through a haze of green resurrection. The first day of the west line, April the 5th, falls upon a Friday, the least auspicious day of the week to begin any enterprise, such as sailing from Spithead, for example. To stand at the post marked west and to turn to face west can be a trial for those sentimentally inclined, as well as for everyone nearby. It is possible to feel the combined force in perfect enfilade of every future second unelapsed, every chain yet to be stretched, every unknown event to be undergone, the unmodified terror of keeping one's latitude. They have been held up by the weather. First snow, by which the fourth day, even undrifted, had reached a depth of 2 feet and 9 inches. Then unclouded skies, which prolonged the impossibility of zenith observations. Thursday night, the 4th, the sky finally clear enough for them to determine their latitude exactly. The next day, the weather holding, they decide not to waste the Friday, but to seize it, bad luck and all. A few wrinkles to be smoothed. Messrs. Darby and Cope have left until the last minute the question of who is to go before and who behind upon the chain. The phrases good enough and more or less must be discouraged from the outset. Rules of precedence for Dixon's circumferenter have to be worked out, principally in that in the case of conflict it must even defer to the sector. Astronomy before magnetism. At last, Mr. Cope pulls up his bob and gathers and stows his plumb line, thus removing his end of the chain from the postmarked west, proceeding then in that direction across the snowy field to Mr. Darby's former station, detachment, the beginning of the west. So they set off, the chain a jingle, wagons a rumble, farm geese a blare, heading into farmland with a quiet roll to it, watched by deer and kine under the usual injunctions against trampling garden patches or molesting orchards, the instruments with a tent of their own, stranger than anything the party expects to see between here and little Christiana, which isn't much anyway, owing to the trees for which 11 more axemen hire on the second week. You'd think these instruments were alive, Matthew Marine grumbles, riding in wagons upon feather mattresses, whilst we sludge along behind, don't we? So they're setting out on the line and getting involved in this kind of mad adventure, which I'm afraid you'll have to read the book to get there. But it involves being chased by Jesuits and a battle between the proponents of Jesuits, of the straight line, who are the Jesuits, and of Feng Shui, There's a Chinaman who's part of the group, and he hates the line. So there's a little bit here about the Jesuits' view of straight line, and then a little bit about the Chinese view of the straight line. So this is the Jesuit view. The model, the wolf of Jesus addressing a room full of students, is imprisonment. Walls are to be the future. Unlike those of the Antichrist, Chinese, these will follow right lines. The world grows restless. Faith is no longer willingly bestowed upon authority, either religious or secular. What a pity. If we may not have love, we will accept consent. If we may not obtain consent, we will build walls. As a wall projected upon the earth's surface becomes a right line, so shall we find that we may shape with arrangements of such lines all we may need, be it in a crofter's hut or a great mother city. Rules of precedence, routes of approach, lines of sight, flows of power. And then a little later, Captain Zhang the Chinaman states, terrible feng shui here, worst I ever saw. You too crazy? Because of? Dixon, indicating behind them in thickening dusk, the visto sweeping away. It acts as a conduit for what we call Shah, or as they say in Spanish California, bad energy. Imagine a wind, a truly ill wind, bringing failure, poverty, disgrace, betrayal, every kind of bad luck there is, all blowing through night and day with many times the force of the worst storm you were ever in. But no one intends to live directly upon the Vistu, Mason speaking as if to a child. The object being that people shall set their homes to one side or another, that it be a boundary, nothing more. Boundary? The Chinaman begins to pull upon his hair and paw the earth with brocade-slippered feet. Everywhere else on earth boundaries follow nature, coastlines, ridgetops, riverbanks, so honouring the dragon or shan within, from which the landscape ever takes its form. To mark a right line upon the earth is to inflict upon the dragon's very flesh a sword slash, a long, perfect scar, impossible for anyone who lives out the year round here to see other than as hateful assault. How can it pass unanswered? 'Tis widely assumed that you are here on behalf of the Jesuit Lemur, co-engineer with Boscovich 15 years ago of yet another long, straight European line, the 2 degrees of latitude sliced across Italy from Rome to Rimini. Ever since then, Shah has flowed unremittingly across that miserable, impoped, bejuked and dismembered peninsula, Tuscany and Milan taken by Austria, Modena and Genova by the French, despotism everywhere. So now a little tale about when the line arrives and there's a house crossing its path. Oh, hang on, I've missed that bit. Here we go. Just bear with me 1 second. There we go, sorry. I lost my page unhelpfully. Here we go, yes. Takes them less than a week to run the line through somebody's house. About 1.5 miles west of the 12-mile arc, 24 chains beyond Little Christiana Creek, on Wednesday, April the 10th. The field book reports at 3 miles, 49 chales, went through Mr. Price's house. Just took a wild guess, Mrs. Price, quite amiable, where we'd build it. Not as if my husband's a surveyor of anything. Which side's to be Pennsylvania, by the way? A mischievous glint in her eyes that Barnes, Farlow, Mones, McLean and others will later all recall. Mr. Price is in town in search of partners for a land ventures. Would you gentlemen mind coming into the house and showing me just where your line does run? Mason and Dixon, already feeling awkward about it, oblige. Dixon up on the roof with a long plumb line, Mason a squint at the snout of the instrument. Mrs. Price, meantime, fills her table with plates of sour cherry fritters, neat tongues pies, a gigantic Indian pudding, pitchers a slosh with homemade cider. Then producing some new hackled streaks of hemp and laying them down in a right line, according to the surveyor's advice, fixing them here and there with tacks across the room, up the stairs, straight down the middle of the bed, of course, which is about when Mr. Reese Price happens to return from his business in town to find merry axeman lounging beneath his sassafras tree, strange stock mingling with his own and watering out of his branch, his house invaded by surveyors, and his wife giving away the larder and waving her tankard about, crying, "Husband, what province were we married in? Ha, see him gape, for he cannot remember. 'Twas in Pennsylvania, my tortoise, but never in Maryland. Hey? So from now on, when I am upon this side of the house, I am in Maryland, legally not your wife, and no longer subject to your authority. Isn't that right, gents?" Ask the Reverend, they replied together, perhaps having noticed that Mr. Price is carrying a long Pennsylvania rifle, 2 horns full of powder, and a good supply of balls. The Rev, by all signs unaware of the trouble the gentlemen are putting him to, not to mention in, beams at the so far but perplexed back inhabitant. "I know but how to perform the ceremony. Perhaps you need to consult an attorney at law." "Separating neighbours is one thing," Reese Price declares, "but separating husband and wife? No wonder you people get shot at all the time. No wonder those chains are called the devil's guts." He must struggle to work himself into a rage, owing to an insufficient exposure so far to evil and sorrow, remaining a youth who trusts all he may meet to be as kindly and as well disposed as he. "What'll happen is," Alex McLean advises, "you'll get hammered paying double taxes, visits all the time from sheriffs of both provinces looking for their quit rents, tax collectors from Philadelphia and Annapolis, and sooner or later you'll have to decide just to get it up on some logs and roll it one way or another. Depends how your property runs, I'd guess. As north is pretty much uphill, Mr. Price is reckoning, 'twould certainly not be easy to roll her up into Pennsylvania as down into Maryland, where I am no longer your wife," his wife reminds him. "Aye, and there's another reason," he nods soberly. "Well then, let's fetch the boys and get to it. 'Tis Maryland ho." I think that's probably the end of it. There's lots of more chapters and excerpts I could have read. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'd be tempted as architects to read the book about the drawing of this great line across the United States. It's fantastically revealing about what we actually spend a lot of our time doing, which is drawing lines that compartment and the landscape and have all kinds of amazing, deep, philosophical, economic, social and political meanings. And the book's a fantastic kind of treatise about that fundamental act of making a mark on the landscape. So, and it's very funny as well. I don't know whether I came across as funny. I usually come across as funny in moments when I'm meant to be serious, but I hope you got some of the humour in the book. Thank you very much for listening. Good night.